Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Iron Coffins, part 21. All of us on U-230 were carefree and unsuspecting. However, our return journey through the Bay of Biscay would become a harbinger of impending disaster. March 25th, the fifth day after the massive convoy battle, passed without incident. With our external fuel tanks pre-flooded, the upper deck flooded, and our METOX warning device retuned to detect the enemy, we cautiously sailed eastward into the coming evening. During the night, we registered 3 radar detections. 3 times we submerged with alarm. 3 times planes dropped their bomb series into our wake. The following morning at 10:12 a.m., Borchardt, our man with the magic eyes, stretched his arm and shouted, "Aircraft!" I saw the small black dot emerging from the cloud cover, hurled the Bay of Biscay cross into the tower, and my men followed. The alarm bell rang, and the bow disappeared below. I took a split-second look at the aircraft, instinctively calculated, and knew we had a grace period of about 30 seconds before the bombs exploded. Then I closed the hatch. U-230 submerged within 18 seconds, giving us a safety margin of 12 seconds. But while U-230 plummeted into the depths at a 40-degree angle, the plane descended with incredible speed toward our diving position. 4 detonations struck our starboard ballast tanks, cruel and hellish. The boat bent under the force of the blows, and then the stern was thrown out of the water. Then U-230 nosedived into the deep. The bombardier had every reason to register a direct hit. Inside the steel tube, everyone was taken by surprise. The approach had been without detection at all. The descent from the clouds was a puzzle. We remained submerged for half an hour, recovering from shock and repairing the damage. 10:55 a.m. We surfaced again. 12:25 p.m. Crash dive due to a twin-engine aircraft. No detection. 4 bombs. 12:50 p.m. We resurfaced. 1:32 p.m. Alarm. Aircraft. Again, no detection. 4 bombs exploded over the stern, the rudder jammed. The aft hydroplanes were out of action and the watertight stern doors were damaged. 2:05 p.m. Surfaced at high speed. 2:22 p.m. Alarm. 4-engine flying boat Sunderland. Hard starboard turn, 4 bombs, laid well, minor damage. It couldn't be denied that the British had set up a tight network of fast aircraft over the Bay of Biscay. Siegmann decided to stay submerged during the day and only surface at night when the Tommies were forced to use their detection devices to find us. However, at night, the same events occurred as during the day. We dove 3 times with alarm and narrowly escaped 12 bombs each time. The next day, we remained submerged, gliding in the depths at a cruising speed of only 3 knots, and listened to the singing, menacing sounds of propellers from a search group stationed by the British in our area. We also heard the endless rolling of a death charge chase on the western horizon. To our surprise, the Bay of Biscay was teeming with life. The conditions had truly changed. After nightfall, we resurfaced. 6 times we dived with alarm, and each time there were the inevitable deadly greetings from the air. But every time, with hard rudder movements and rapid descent, we managed to escape the crashing bomb onslaught. We spent the next day again at a depth of 60 meters, about 200 feet, accompanied by occasional unexplained explosions. At dusk, we resurfaced and around midnight entered a larger French fishing fleet peacefully catching sardines. Their presence saved us from further aerial harassment. Occasionally, we heard a drone of aircraft engines, then we came close to some trawlers, moving from boat to boat and startling the fishermen with our erratic maneuvers. Shortly after daybreak, we finally reached the rendezvous point where a patrol boat was supposed to meet us, but the sea was empty. Everything seemed to go wrong. Our prospects of reaching the harbor soon were not exactly overwhelming. They were further in doubt when we learned about the sinking of U-665 at this precise location. U-665 had been attacked and sunk by an aircraft only an hour before joining the convoy. We immediately submerged and waited. Finally, around 12 o'clock, the minesweeper arrived with a 6-hour delay. Siegmann waited until the ship had come so close that he could make out the captain's eye color with his telescope. Then we surfaced. Pale-faced men emerged from the foul-smelling tube and eagerly breathed in the fresh air. Some sailors loaded magazines into the anti-aircraft guns and took positions behind the weapons. The others attempted their first uncertain steps on the deck. A faint violet streak on the starboard side heralded the land. The first green spots, sunlit white walls and red roofs slowly became visible. U-230 reached the port of Brest without firing a shot. Siegmann, his white cap jauntily perched on his blond head, looked like a Viking with his long red beard. He puffed his cigar with satisfaction. His crew, gathered on deck, smoked, joked and combed their beards, their faces brightly lit by the sun. A welcoming shout echoed across the inner harbor basin as I steered U-230 towards the stone pier. A Navy band played a resounding march. Our men, completing their first patrol, were stunned by the attention. Even for us old veterans, this return after 8 weeks of battling storms, the sea and the enemy was a moving affair. Ahead, a gigantic concrete bunker emerged from the water. The bomb-proof U-boat bunker capable of providing shelter for over 40 wolves, U-230 found its way into an opening in this newly built hideout. We secured the lines, and the crowd on the shore suddenly fell silent. The crew stood in rows on the stern deck, and I reported the men to the captain. Siegmann informed the commander of the 9th U-boat flotilla, Captain Lehmann-Willenbrock, of the successful return of the boat from its mission. 3 cheers from the shore, followed by handshakes all around. As we, pale-faced and bearded, walked cautiously on solid ground with our sea legs still weak, we were welcomed by the Marine Administration's girls with flowers and kisses. We staggered on our unsteady sea legs into the buildings of the 9th U-boat flotilla, where we settled in, still dazed from the welcoming celebrations and the cool German beer. Our new accommodations were well maintained and heavily guarded. Large camouflage nets were installed on the roofs of the individual buildings to deceive English reconnaissance planes. Before I had a chance to shave, I was caught up in several rounds of joyful greetings. They stretched well into the night. Proud of our victories and eager to be carefree once again, we indulged in excess. We feasted on the rich Breton food, drank too much of the French wines, sang the old sea shanties until the glasses trembled. No one had any objections. On the contrary, it was good to know that after weeks of effort, mental and physical strain, our friends at the base understood our triumphs, our troubles, and our frustrations. The following morning at 8 o'clock I mustered the crew in the base's courtyard. Only a small group had shown up for roll call, the rest were still out of action. Over the next few hours I was busy reviving the men, applying cold compresses to Riedel and Friedrich, and equipping the captain with the documents he needed for his briefing at the High Command. It wasn't until 16 hours on land that I got to think about myself. I repeated the ritual of rejuvenation, one I remembered all too well from my days in Lorient, taking a hot bath, carefully shaving off the 9-week black beard, donning a freshly pressed blue uniform, and then sitting in the barber's chair with my eyes closed while my long mane was trimmed. Later, as a new man, I sorted my mail. I opened Marianne's letters first. Things didn't seem to be going well in Berlin. She wrote, "The English were here again. Last week they came for 4 nights and twice in a single day. The attacks are terrifying. As you know, I work in the center of Berlin. Last week we spent long, anxious hours in the air raid shelter of the office building. While I sat with the others in the cellar, a direct hit struck the office building across the street, completely destroying it. Everyone in the building was buried in the cellar. I wonder, why do we seek refuge in a trap? When I finally went home and saw the burning houses, the destruction and the dead, I wept the whole way. My best friend was buried in the rubble that day, and I can't understand why we can't drive the Tommies away. Berlin is our capital and should have better air defenses. It's so hard to say where we go from here. Göring promised us that no English aircraft would reach German territory. We wonder what has become of his promises. Yesterday I heard the special reports about the great success of our U-boats in the Atlantic, and I thought of you. I pray that you always return from your patrols and that my letters reach you. I always think of you and wish I could be with you. Please take good care of yourself. And when the war is over, everything will be just like back then at Lake Constance under the chestnut tree in that one long summer night of 1939. I was dismayed. I thought about asking Marianne to leave Berlin and settle in the countryside at least for some time until the danger had passed. Thankfully, the news from my parents were nowhere near as dramatic. Mother wrote about some unsuccessful air raids in the Frankfurt area. She reported that people had come together, helping each other to extinguish small roof fires, that some English planes had been shot down, and that father had a lot of business to deal with, and Trudel, a soldier's wife for 7 months, was still assisting him as a secretary. So the news from home was good, and in my letters to Mother and Marianne, I wrote that everything would soon improve. I firmly believed in what I was saying, despite increasing contrary developments. The air raids on our cities had steadily increased in scale and intensity, far surpassing the point of mere harassment. Radio and newspapers reported only vaguely on the bomb damage and casualties, but I had the impression that we were indeed suffering significant losses and damage. There were also other bitter facts to face. I reluctantly accepted reports of setbacks on the Eastern Front that had occurred during our mission. The Soviet winter offensive had culminated in the destruction of our divisions at Stalingrad, where the 6th Army had been defeated, captured, or dispersed. The news from the North African theater of war was also not encouraging. The British, with fresh forces, had launched attacks on our desert positions, pushing the front further to the west. However, all of these setbacks seemed to me to be of a local nature. I did not believe they would influence the ultimate outcome of the war. In fact, the only front where we were making excellent progress was our naval front. Our submarines, operating in large wolf packs, sank an incredible amount of Allied shipping and struck hard from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean Sea. March had proven to be one of the best months in the history of submarines. Our boats had sent nearly 650,000 tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. Currently, about 250 submarines were in action on various fronts, undergoing training in the Baltic Sea, in German ports for equipment, and in shipyards for overhaul. As for the future, the submarine construction program bore the stamp of the highest priority. However, even in the naval war, our successes were wrested from the enemy with a tenacity that hadn't been seen in previous years. As the convoys grew in size, the cooperation of the English and American escort forces improved significantly. New destroyer classes, fast and agile corvettes increased the dangers of our attacks. But the scourge of enemy bombers was worse. More and more aircraft pushed deeper into the vastness of the Atlantic, bombing our outbound or returning boats with increasing accuracy. The aerial threat had added new dimensions to naval warfare, and adapting to these new conditions became increasingly challenging. I was convinced that the outcome of the war depended on the success of our submarines in the Atlantic. It was all too clear that the Allies had had enough time to recover from their initial setbacks. Their new activities on land, on water, and in the air were solely due to the supply of war material brought from the USA across the Atlantic. We submariners were the only ones who could prevent American food, war material, ammunition, planes and bombs from being unloaded in British ports or at the docks of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. We had to intercept and destroy the enemy at sea before he could amass enough war material and manpower for an invasion of the European mainland from the British Isles, and we were convinced that we could prevent that. With the help of all available hands, U-230 was cleared out and handed over to the shipyard engineers at the end of the second day in the harbor. My work on board was only a small part of a hectic routine. I created drawings of our attacks, transcribed the war diary, and prepared reports for Siegmann's presentation to Dönitz. The captain had been ordered to Paris, where Admiral Dönitz had meanwhile established his headquarters after being appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine in January. I also made preparations to send a third of the crew on leave. But not everything was work and crew care. I also found time to think about Yvonne. And on a late afternoon in April, I went into the city. Armed with a bouquet of flowers, I entered the bookstore where I had met her. But Yvonne wasn't there. Assuming that she had changed her job, I left the small shop without involving the owner in my personal affairs and started searching for her in the other bookstores. But Yvonne was nowhere to be found. Finally, I decided to make the long journey to her apartment, where I had spent many nights. But Yvonne seemed to be unknown there. Even the neighbors claimed not to know her. On the way back to the city, I tossed the flowers over a low stone wall, convinced that I would never see Yvonne again. Then, yielding to a sudden impulse, I returned to the first bookstore and asked the old owner behind the counter, "Pardon, monsieur, where can I find Yvonne?" "Yvonne? Oh, Yvonne." He blinked over the rim of his glasses and told me what I already knew. "She's not here anymore." I repeated my question. "Tell me, where can I find her?" "Young man, there's not much to say. Yvonne left town 8 or 9 months ago. She said she wanted to go to an aunt in Toulouse. That's what she told me, but," he conveyed with a meaningful look, "she had to leave the town. Didn't you know she was already under surveillance even back then? Such things can't remain a secret here." The old man's gaze was devoid of bitterness. Only sadness was in his eyes. And that was the last time I heard of Yvonne. With our goodbyes to Yvonne, we move on to the after-action report. U-230 narrowly escaped death multiple times again in this episode, but made it back to France more or less intact. We are coming up on what is commonly called the Black May of 1943, and we will find out how Herbert deals with the loss reports of no less than 25% of the operational U-boats of the Kriegsmarine in this month. 41 U-boats were sunk in May 1943, and this was considered the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. But before then, there's some partying in order for Herbert, which you will hear about in the next episode. Until then, if you like this video, you know what to do, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you then. Cheers.